How dare you drink my husband's water? It was my first week working undercover at my husband's company. During my lunch break, I picked up his water tumbler, and his secretary slapped me across the face. She had no idea. She didn't know that I was the true owner of this company, Sterling Technologies, and the legal wife of the man she was sleeping with. Now, it is time to put everything back where it belongs. I will make them weep tears of blood. If you want to hear the thrilling conclusion of this ultimate revenge story, keep reading. Let me tell you how it all began. I joined my husband's company hiding my true identity. During lunch, I mindlessly took a sip of water from his custom tumbler. Immediately, his secretary lunged at me. "How dare you touch his things?" she shrieked. When my husband arrived and saw what was happening, all the color drained from his face. Sterling Technologies was my father's life's work. Starting from a cramped, leaky garage in Queens, my father poured his sweat, tears, and blood into building what was now on the verge of becoming a $10 billion tech giant. The day my father passed away, the weight of that massive empire and the fate of thousands of employees fell onto my shoulders. For an only child who had lived a sheltered life of literature, afternoon teas, and strict family protection, it was an unbearable burden. That was when Mark Davis appeared like a safe harbor. A young, charismatic executive from a middle-class background. He had a silver tongue and seemed to deeply understand the crushing weight I carried. We were married amid the envy of high society. I handed over the company, my father's legacy, to my husband, like a precious wedding gift, willingly stepping back to become a supportive wife. Every day, I stayed in our Upper East Side townhouse, meticulously curating his wardrobe and preparing his meals. I believed my sacrifices would be rewarded with a peaceful home and a husband devoted to protecting my family's business. I gave him full executive control, maintaining only the title of majority shareholder on paper. But life rarely goes as planned, and human greed knows no bounds. Over the past 3 years, Mark's business trips became increasingly frequent. The nights he came home reeking of unfamiliar perfume and expensive scotch multiplied in direct proportion to the company's rising revenue. His affectionate words vanished, replaced by constant irritation, using work stress as an excuse to avoid family dinners. A woman's intuition whispered a dark premonition. When a wife notices something suspicious about her husband, she cannot simply keep her eyes closed. I decided I would no longer sit at home waiting for his lies. Using a lifelong connection with Brenda, the HR director who had worked with my father since the early days, I created a fake resume and applied as an entry-level administrative assistant at my own company. I wanted to see with my own eyes how my husband ran the business, how he treated the employees, and exactly who he was behind my back. On my first day, I left my designer dresses in the closet. Instead, I wore a basic white button-down and cheap black slacks from Target, pulling my hair up with a simple plastic claw clip. Inside the gleaming Midtown Manhattan headquarters, absolutely no one recognized the once glamorous Sarah Sterling. The morning flew by in a blur of photocopying, making coffee, and organizing conference rooms. In the afternoon, my manager asked me to take an iced Americano to the CEO's office. Carrying the tray down the familiar, plush-carpeted hallway where my father used to hold my hand, an indescribable emotion surged within me. The heavy mahogany door to the executive suite was slightly ajar, a narrow sliver of light spilling out. Just as I raised my hand to knock, the sounds coming from inside froze me in my tracks. A woman's voice, sharp and flirtatious, echoed through the gap. I instantly recognized it as Chloe Richards, the stunning secretary Mark had personally hired 6 months ago. She was whining, her tone sickeningly sweet. She mocked the CEO's wife at home, calling her a useless parasite living off her husband's glory, a woman rotting away in a townhouse who knew nothing about how the real world worked. Chloe boasted that she was the CEO's true right hand, a modern woman who actually deserved to share in his success. I stood rooted to the spot. The tray in my hands shook violently. I waited for Mark to defend me, to reprimand his arrogant secretary, and protect the honor of the woman who had entrusted him with her family's empire. No defense came. Instead, Mark's low chuckle drifted out, dripping with mockery. He agreed with his mistress. He complained that I was boring, hopelessly tied down by old money traditions, and as thrilling to live with as a log. He claimed he only endured all these years with me to gain the board's trust by leveraging the founder's daughter title. He made sweet promises to Chloe. Just a little longer. Once everything was finalized, He would kick me out and give her her rightful place in high society. The iced Americano sloshed violently, drops spilling onto my knuckles. A bone-chilling cold pierced me. Every word they spoke was a blade, slicing through 3 years of my foolish trust and sacrifice. My kindness had become their punchline. I took a deep breath, swallowing the bitter lump in my throat. I absolutely refused to cry. At my age, facing a betrayal that trampled on all loyalty and affection, I wouldn't wail like a petulant child. The more intense the pain, the unnervingly clearer my mind became. I reached out a cold hand and shoved the mahogany door wide open. It hit the wall with a loud thud that echoed through the massive suite. The two people inside jumped apart like thieves caught red-handed. Mark, who had been stroking Chloe's hair, frantically pulled his hand back and pretended to adjust his bespoke suit jacket. Chloe leaped off the sofa, panic flashing across her heavily contoured face. But seconds later, upon noticing the cheap, blue admin assistant lanyard around my neck, her arrogance returned, and she glared at me like I was dirt. I walked in with an entirely expressionless face, keeping my eyes fixed on the imported rug. I played the role of the terrified junior employee flawlessly. Approaching the massive oak desk, I carefully set the iced Americano on a coaster. Chloe scoffed, marching over and slamming her palm on the desk. Using her most condescending tone, she berated me. "Is this how the admin team works now? Do you not know how to knock? Are you blind to what the CEO is doing?" She sneered at my outfit, claiming my dowdy, pathetic presence was polluting the executive suite. She threatened to report me to HR and dock my pay. I bowed my head. "I'm sorry," I mumbled, taking 2 steps back like a properly scolded subordinate. At that exact moment, as she pointed her finger at my face, the light from the crystal chandelier caught her ring finger, nearly blinding me. I looked closer, and my blood ran freezing cold. On Chloe's finger sat a massive diamond ring. But it wasn't a generic piece from a Fifth Avenue jeweler. It was a blue diamond surrounded by a white gold rose, with meticulously carved leaves and vines. It was the exact design I had spent nights sketching myself. It was the draft for our upcoming 3rd anniversary ring, which I kept locked in my personal safe at home. I had planned to take it to a master jeweler in the Diamond District next month. How did my top-secret design end up as a physical ring on this young mistress's hand? There was only one answer. Mark had secretly discovered my safe combination, stolen his wife's blood and sweat design, and gifted it to another woman. This betrayal had crossed the line of mere infidelity. Stealing a wife's anniversary design to give to a mistress, mocking the wife behind her back, and planning a future with a third party, this was something far darker. I realized a terrifying truth. They weren't just having a sleazy office affair. They were plotting a systematic, vicious takeover. Chloe wasn't just a girl looking for a sugar daddy. She was a cunning parasite waiting to kick the rightful owner out of the nest and take everything. And Mark, blinded by power, was planning to swallow the sterling tech empire built on my father's blood and sweat whole. I turned and walked out of the room, shutting the door quietly. As I walked down the empty corridor, the clicking of my cheap heels against the marble floor rang in my ears. The fiery rage I initially felt vanished completely, replaced by a terrifyingly calm, icy rationality. The enemy had shown their true, shameless face. I could no longer remain the compliant puppet wife. I had to protect my father's legacy with my own 2 hands, by whatever means necessary. I would show them that Arthur Sterling's daughter was not a weak woman to be trampled on. This war for survival officially began the moment that mahogany door clicked shut. Lunchtime at the Sterling Tech headquarters was the liveliest hour of the day. The expansive cafeteria on the 6th floor was clearly divided into 2 sections, a perfect visual of corporate hierarchy. One side was packed with hundreds of regular employees at cramped laminate tables. The other was a luxurious VIP section with plush leather booths and warm lighting, reserved for directors and above. Carrying a cheap plastic tray, I navigated through the loud, laughing crowds. My eyes weren't on the food, but on the VIP section. Chloe was sitting there, legs crossed arrogantly like a queen. Several middle managers hovered around her, fetching her food, pouring her water, and kissing up to her. In front of her, on the pristine glass table, sat a matte black Yeti tumbler perfectly engraved with the letter M. Seeing that tumbler made my blood boil. I had custom ordered it from an artisanal engraver overseas specifically for Mark, wanting him to have something personal at the office. For a mere secretary to brazenly place the CEO's highly personal item on her lunch table in front of dozens of executives was a blatant, shameless claim of ownership. They no longer cared who knew. They were flaunting their filthy affair in broad daylight. I took a deep breath to steady my heart rate, then suddenly changed direction, marching straight toward the VIP section. As I passed Chloe's table, I intentionally stopped. The eyes of the sycophants immediately turned to me, glaring with disgust and contempt. A lowly admin in the VIP zone was an absolute taboo. Coolly, I set my tray down on an adjacent empty table, reached out, and grabbed the matte black tumbler. I popped the lid and took a huge gulp. Inside was warm, homemade ginger lemon tea, the exact bittersweet blend I had woken up early to brew for him that morning. The air in the cafeteria instantly froze. It was as if a vacuum had sucked all the sound out of the room. The manager's eyes bugged out, jaws dropping at the sheer audacity. Chloe's heavily manicured eyes widened, and her contoured face flushed bright red with fury. Her pride was shattered. She shot up, slamming her hands into my tray and knocking it to the floor. The ceramic plates shattered with a deafening crash that echoed across the massive cafeteria. Food splattered across the polished tiles. Every single employee stopped eating and whipped their heads around. The room fell dead silent, save for the faint hum of the background music. Like a rabid animal, Chloe lunged and slapped me across the face with everything she had. Smack. The dry, sharp sound cracked like a whip. My left cheek instantly burned, the sheer force leaving my ear ringing. I stumbled half a step back to keep my balance, tasting the metallic tang of blood mixing with the ginger tea in my mouth. Hands on her hips, Chloe pointed her fake diamond-clad finger right at my face. She began screaming the most vulgar insults imaginable. She called me a filthy, psychotic lowlife who dared to touch the CEO's personal property. Surrounded by hundreds of watching employees, she shrieked that the tumbler belonged to her man, and trash like me didn't have the right to breathe the same air, let alone touch his things. The entire cafeteria held its breath. No one dared step forward to defend me. They just stared with a mix of pity and absolute terror of the CEO's untouchable favorite. I stood up straight and slowly wiped the blood from the corner of my mouth with the back of my hand. The stinging pain meant nothing. In fact, this brutal slap was the exact catalyst I had been waiting for all morning. Chloe's arrogance and stupidity had peaked. She had just dug her own grave in front of the entire company. The crowd of employees instinctively parted, creating a pathway toward the elevators. Mark was rushing into the cafeteria. The sound of breaking plates and his mistress's screeching had apparently reached the executive corridors. As the CEO, he had to make an appearance to contain the chaos and protect his executive image. At first, Mark's face was twisted in irritation, the look of a busy executive annoyed by petty employee drama. He strode authoritatively into the center of the mess. His angry gaze swept over the spilled food, then finally landed on the woman standing tall, holding her red, swollen cheek. The moment his eyes locked onto mine, Mark stopped dead in his tracks, as if he had stepped on a landmine. All the blood vanished from his handsome face. He turned as ashen as a corpse. His pupils shrank to pinpricks, locked onto my completely emotionless expression. The towering, intimidating CEO froze like a statue in the middle of the room. His arms, hanging limply at his sides, began to shake violently, his fingers twitching in sheer, unadulterated terror. Chloe, blinded by power and rage, completely missed the horrifying shift in her lover's demeanor. Seeing her powerful protector arrive, she fully leaned into playing the victim. She rushed over, clinging to Mark's arm, pressing her chest against him, and whining. She pointed a manicured nail at me and demanded he call security to drag this crazy bitch out of the building. She wailed that I had humiliated her publicly and touched his personal items just to get attention. But Mark seemed deaf to her screeching. He didn't answer. He didn't comfort her. Like a man with a noose tightening around his neck, his mouth opened and closed like a dying fish, unable to form a single coherent syllable. His eyes were wide with a terror so profound it bordered on insanity. He knew exactly who the woman in the cheap white shirt was. The person standing in the center of this chaos wasn't some nameless admin. It was Sarah Sterling, the sole heir to Sterling Technologies, the woman who owned 100% of the controlling shares of the very company he managed. And most importantly, the legal wife he assumed was sitting quietly at home, waiting for him to return for dinner. I lowered my hand from my cheek, revealing the stark red handprint on my pale skin. I kept my chin high, staring straight into the depths of Mark's violently trembling eyes. The corner of my mouth slowly curled up into a cold, contemptuous smile. That smile was a death sentence for his career, his reputation, and his life as he knew it. I didn't scream or cry. I didn't pull hair or throw a tantrum. I used a silence as sharp as a scalpel to sever every nerve in the traitor's panicking mind. Mark took a step back, swallowing hard, cold sweat beating on his forehead. Their filthy game of hide-and-seek was over. From this moment on, I was the one holding the gun. The air in the cafeteria was pulled taut as a piano wire. Hundreds of people held their breath, watching this insane drama unfold. Chloe was still stomping her designer heels, violently shaking Mark's arm, demanding he fire me on the spot to make an example of me. When Mark remained paralyzed, pale, and silent, Chloe huffed in frustration and lunged at me to deliver another slap. This time, Mark snapped out of it. Realizing the apocalyptic consequences about to rain down upon him, his survival instincts kicked in. He grabbed Chloe's arm with brutal force, yanking her back so hard she nearly fell over. Chloe gasped, glaring at him. "Why are you stopping me from disciplining this insolent little rat?" she screamed. Her absurd, bottomless arrogance made her the worst actor in a cheap comedy, turning herself into a laughingstock in front of the entire corporate ladder. I raised my hand, tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear, stood up perfectly straight, and raised my voice. My words were slow, crisp, and loud enough for every single employee in the massive room to hear perfectly. Looking dead into Chloe's eyes, I clearly pointed out that the title of husband she had just proudly shouted was a massive, humiliating miscalculation. "The legal wife of CEO Mark Davis," I said, my voice echoing like cold steel. "The only name listed on the marriage certificate recognized by the state of New York is an entirely different person. You are nothing but a shameless homewrecker trying to destroy a family. So, by what legal authority are you demanding anyone be fired? What right do you have to parade around Sterling Technologies acting like you own the place?" The crowd erupted. It was like a bomb had gone off in a beehive. The information I just dropped was beyond the wildest imaginations of these corporate drones. The eyes that had previously looked at me with pity now turned to Chloe with shock, disgust, and blatant mockery. The future CEO's wife persona she had spent so much money and effort building shattered into a million humiliating pieces, tearing her reputation to shreds. Mark's teeth were literally chattering. He couldn't even look me in the eye. The paralyzing fear of losing his CEO title, the stolen millions, and his public standing completely crushed whatever pathetic ego he had left. While Chloe flailed and screamed for an explanation, Mark clamped his hand around her wrist like an iron vice and dragged her out of the cafeteria, practically running like a criminal fleeing a burning building. Watching the pathetic, cowardly retreat of the two traitors, I calmly brushed a speck of food off my sleeve. My first counterattack had landed flawlessly. Their false pride had been brutally trampled in front of the entire company, but I knew in my heart this was merely the overture. A bruised ego was nowhere near enough to pay for what they had tried to do to my father's legacy. I walked out of the cafeteria with perfect posture through a sea of stunned onlookers, ready to set my legal traps. Long after the terrified faces of Mark and Chloe disappeared behind the elevator doors, the cafeteria remained in a state of shell shock. Brenda from HR quickly slipped through the crowd, grabbed my arm, and pulled me into a secluded corner near the fire stairs. Brenda was a middle-aged veteran who had been with my father since the startup days. Gentle and averse to conflict, she desperately wanted to avoid corporate warfare. She let go of my arm, sighing heavily, her face etched with worry. In a hushed whisper, she begged me to go back to my desk, write a resignation letter, and leave the building immediately before I got myself killed. According to Brenda, Chloe wasn't just the boss's favorite. She controlled HR decisions from the shadows and ruthlessly destroyed anyone in her path. Brenda thought I was a foolish girl throwing gas on a fire, insisting an entry-level temp couldn't possibly win against the top executives. I listened quietly. I understood her genuine concern, but she had absolutely no idea who the woman standing in front of her truly was, nor the iron blood running through my veins. Instead of explaining, I reached into my slacks, pulled out my smartphone, and hit play on the voice memo I had been secretly recording. The audio captured everything flawlessly. Chloe's vulgar insults, the crashing of the ceramic plates, and the violent, sickening smack of her slapping my face. The recording was so clear you could hear her heavy, rage-filled breathing. Brenda went pale. Her lips trembled, and she swallowed her protests. As an HR veteran, she knew exactly how legally devastating this evidence of physical assault and workplace harassment was. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, gave Brenda a polite nod, and walked to the cramped, dusty admin office on the third floor. The room smelled of old paper and stale printer ink. I pulled up a chair to an outdated desktop computer and plugged a highly encrypted USB drive into the port. I created a secure folder, carefully transferred the audio file, and clinically named it Evidence 1. Public disclosure of inappropriate relationship and physical assault. Phase 1 was complete. I had promised myself I would never fight like a reality TV star, pulling hair or screaming in the streets. I was the only daughter of Arthur Sterling, a man who built a multi-billion-dollar empire through sheer intellect and iron will. I would use the cold, hard letter of the law, the brutal rules of the free market, and undeniable, bulletproof evidence to take back what was mine. They thought I was a fragile greenhouse flower living in my husband's shadow. They were dead wrong. The moment they crossed the final line, I became a hurricane, ready to wipe out the trash infesting my company. My father was a visionary who foresaw the treacherous traps of the corporate world. Before he died, he quietly brought me into his study and handed me an ultra-classified, master-level system administrator token. It was a digital backdoor so buried that not even the current CTO of Sterling Tech knew it existed. This master access allowed me to review and extract every single byte of data across the company, from internal emails to corporate ledgers, without leaving a single digital footprint. Later that evening, when the admin office was completely empty, I sat alone in the dark. I plugged the physical token into the computer and typed in the 6-4-character encrypted passphrase. The screen instantly flipped to a silent black and green command interface. I began sweeping 3 years of Mark's digital life: email archives, internal Slack messages, and corporate expense approval systems. The numbers and documents that flooded the screen made my stomach turn. Human greed is uglier than any weapon. I downloaded hundreds of receipts for presidential suites at 5-star Manhattan hotels. Receipts for exotic crocodile leather Birkin bags. Receipts for 6-figure diamond watches. All of this grotesque luxury was paid for through the company's client entertainment accounts, a blatant and massive embezzlement of corporate funds. Even in their corporate Slack channels, they brazenly referred to each other as babe and hubby, using thinly veiled code words. I gathered everything into a folder named Evidence 2, Embezzlement of Corporate Funds. But the rot went much deeper than a few luxury handbags. I dug into the cash flows for our recent joint ventures. Tens of millions of dollars of Sterling Tech capital had been funneled out under the guise of marketing and PR contracts, all personally signed off by Mark, going into 3 newly established media LLCs. I copied the employer identification numbers, EINs, and ran them through the Delaware Division of Corporations database. The veil dropped. The registered agents and CEOs for all 3 shell companies had the last name Richards, sharing the same residential address in New Jersey. They belonged to Chloe's older brother and mother. They were systematically bleeding the company's core profits. This wasn't just a moral failing. This was massive corporate fraud, a deliberate breach of fiduciary duty, resulting in tens of millions in damages. I screenshotted every bank wire transfer and fraudulent contract, saving them as evidence 3. Fraudulent asset transfers via shell corporations. Every page I turned proved that my 3 years of patience had been a horrific insult to my father's memory. Just as I was about to unplug the USB, I remembered one final secret. To prevent corporate espionage, my father had secretly ordered his most trusted security engineers to install a microscopic hidden camera inside the crystal chandelier of the CEO's office. The device ran independently, beaming data straight to an off-site private server. Ironically, this high-tech paranoia was about to become the ultimate weapon to unmask his beloved son-in-law. I accessed the private server and filtered through the last 3 months of footage. Skipping the boring executive meetings, my finger stopped on a late-night timestamp from exactly 2 months ago. The high-definition video showed Mark and Chloe perfectly clear. Right there, on the $40,000 Italian leather sofa in the center of the office, they were entangled, rolling around. The audio was pristine. Chloe was stroking Mark's chest, whining, demanding he hurry up and kick his hag of a wife out so she could take her rightful place. She complained she was sick of being a secret and didn't want to share her man anymore. Mark kissed her neck, his voice dripping with a cold, calculated cruelty that made my blood run cold. He promised her that he was pushing hard to secure a massive new investment round from Apex Capital. He explicitly laid out the plan. The moment the hundreds of millions in fresh capital hit the company accounts, he would use the shell companies to drain the core assets, leaving Sterling Tech a hollowed-out, debt-ridden shell. Once the money was clean and hidden, he would force me to sign divorce papers, using every dirty trick in the book to strip me of my last dime. He literally called me a stupid roadblock he had to pave over. This 5-minute video was the smoking gun. It proved criminal conspiracy to commit corporate raiding. I downloaded the HD file and named it Evidence 4: Conspiracy to Defraud and Asset Stripping. Looking at the black screen, whatever lingering pity or matrimonial affection I had left burned to ash. There would be no mercy. I slipped the USB into the hidden pocket of my handbag. The traps were set. It was time to drag the rats out into the harsh light of justice. By the time the streetlights flickered on, I didn't go straight back to the Atherton-style mansion. I hailed a cab and headed to a quiet, wood-paneled private club in Midtown. The smell of aged leather and expensive cigars filled the air. At a corner booth, Robert Vance was already waiting. Robert wasn't just a heavyweight corporate litigator. He was my father's oldest friend, the man who had fought in the trenches with him to build the company. He currently served as the general counsel for Sterling Tech, functioning as the last line of defense for the company's integrity. I greeted him respectfully and slid the encrypted USB drive across the polished mahogany table. In a low voice, I summarized the absolute chaos of the lunchroom incident, then asked Robert to open his laptop and look at the financial trails and the hidden camera footage himself. The seasoned lawyer's calm demeanor vanished. As he scrolled through the fraudulent wire transfers and heard Mark's sociopathic voice on the video, his face contorted with rage. He slammed his fist onto the table, cursing Mark as an ungrateful, backstabbing animal. I poured him a glass of scotch, handed it to him, and maintained a deadly calm. I laid out my battle plan without an ounce of compromise. First objective: Mark leaves Sterling Tech with absolutely nothing and pays full restitution for the stolen funds. Second objective: I invoke my majority shareholder rights, retake complete operational control, and stabilize the Apex Capital investment. Third objective: we file a criminal referral with the DA's office to put Mark, Chloe, and her entire family of accomplices behind bars. Robert agreed instantly, looking at me with fierce pride. Finally seeing the ghost of his old friend and the daughter, he promised to stay at his office all night, drafting an aggressive divorce petition, filing for immediate asset freezes, and submitting an emergency whistleblower report directly to the board's audit committee. We set the time to drop the guillotine, the emergency board of directors meeting tomorrow morning. I thanked him and walked out into the Manhattan night, feeling like a soldier marching to the front lines. When the clock struck 10:00 p.m., my cab pulled up to the massive iron gates of our estate. This house was once my dream home, but stepping inside now felt like walking into the graveyard of my youth. I walked into the sprawling living room. Mark was sitting on a designer sofa. The crystal ashtray on the coffee table was full of half-smoked cigarettes. The second he saw me, he put out his cigarette and jumped up, instantly slipping into his familiar, fake-doting husband persona. He hurried over, holding a tube of expensive burn ointment. Putting on an expression of deep guilt, he spoke in a soft, soothing voice, claiming the cafeteria incident was just a massive misunderstanding. He threw his mistress under the bus without hesitation, claiming Chloe was young, impulsive, and cracked under work stress. He swore to me that tomorrow he would publicly reprimand her, make her grovel, and restore my honor. He played the part of the helpless, heartbroken husband forced to watch his beloved wife suffer. I crossed my arms. I didn't even look at the ointment. I just stood there, watching his pathetic performance play out. When he finally ran out of breath, I asked him in a voice made of steel, "Which part exactly was a misunderstanding? Was it you breaking into my safe to steal our anniversary design to use as an engagement ring for your mistress? Or was it you setting up shell corporations in Delaware to bleed my company dry so you could leave me penniless in the divorce?" Hearing his deepest, darkest secret sliced open, Mark dropped the ointment onto the rug. His fake smile shattered, his eyes blowing wide in sheer terror. I slowly unclasped my handbag, pulled out a stack of high-res color photographs, and tossed them onto the glass table. They were screenshots from the hidden camera footage, him and his secretary plotting their corporate heist on the office sofa. I looked him dead in the eye. "Prepare your defense attorneys," I said coldly. "The loving husband act ends tonight. Now, it's time for consequences." The living room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the HVAC system. Mark bent down, his hands shaking violently as he picked up the photos. The longer he looked, the more his face morphed from deathly pale to a violent, humiliating red. Cornered, the true nature of the greedy parasite finally exploded. He threw the photos down and glared at me, his demeanor turning feral. He pointed a finger at my face and snarled. He called me a psychotic bitch, screaming how dare I spy on him. He beat his chest, roaring that if it weren't for him working 8-0-hour weeks for the last 3 years, Sterling Tech would have gone bankrupt. He had completely deluded himself into believing he was the sole creator of the empire. He sneered that he controlled the entire board of directors, and a useless housewife like me could never take him down. He ordered me to shred the documents and go back to being a quiet trophy wife, or he would strip my assets, lock me out, and leave me begging on the streets. I laughed, a loud, clear, utterly contemptuous laugh that echoed through the massive house. I took a step forward, unfazed by his rabid posturing. I looked at the twisted face of the man I had once loved. Whatever warmth was left had turned to ash. In a razor-sharp tone, I delivered my ultimatum. Tomorrow morning by 9:00 a.m., you will personally sign a termination letter with cause for Chloe Richards. Concurrently, you will fully disclose all marital assets and return every cent of the embezzled corporate funds. If you do this, I will consider a quiet, uncontested divorce to save you the humiliation of a public trial. Mark's neck veins bulged. He swept his arm across the table, sending a water glass smashing against the wall, screaming his refusal. He called me delusional. He told me to pack my bags and get the hell out of his sight, and never set foot in his company again. I didn't argue. I calmly picked up my bag, turned on my heel, and walked out the front door. My heels clicked rhythmically against the stone driveway. Inside my jacket pocket, a micro-digital recorder blinked red. Every single threat of asset stripping and extortion he had just screamed was perfectly preserved, the final nail in his coffin. The next morning, the New York sky was brilliant and clear. Sunlight poured into my temporary suite at the Plaza Hotel. I woke up early and stood in front of the full-length mirror. Today, the timid admin assistant was dead. I chose a commanding wine-colored power suit. The sharp tailoring accentuated a figure that was slender but forged in iron. Pointed-toe black stilettos gave me a fierce, rhythmic stride. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, classic chignon and applied a bold, blood-red lipstick. The true owner of Sterling Technologies was finally awake and dressed for war. At exactly 8:00 a.m., my Blacktown car pulled up to the glass-paneled headquarters. I stepped out, radiating absolute authority, and walked through the revolving doors. The lobby security and receptionists stared, jaws dropped. They had zero idea that this terrifyingly elegant woman was the same employee who got slapped in the cafeteria yesterday. Ignoring the whispers, I bypassed the regular banks and swiped into the executive elevator. At that exact second, an emergency automated email blasted out to the inboxes of all 5,000 employees from HR. The message was brief but nuclear. Effective immediately, Chloe Richards is terminated for cause from the position of executive assistant to the CEO. She is to surrender all company property and be escorted from the premises. The company practically exploded, but the system had a second email, sent only to the C-suite and board of directors. Robert Vance, acting as general counsel, officially called an emergency board meeting. The agenda, written in bold red text: fiduciary breaches and moral turpitude regarding the chief executive officer. The storm had hit, ripping away the fake facade of peace. I stepped off the elevator on the penthouse floor. The corridor was silent, save for the clicking of my heels. In my hand was a heavy black binder containing the bulletproof evidence Robert and I had finalized overnight. My heart beat with a steady, fierce rhythm. I walked straight toward the massive double doors of the boardroom. Behind those doors sat a den of thieves, but it was also the place where I would reclaim my family's honor. The executive assistant guarding the door panicked when she saw me. She jumped up, arms spread wide, stuttering that a highly classified executive meeting was in session, and absolutely no unauthorized personnel were allowed. I gave her a look that could cut glass. The sheer, suffocating pressure radiating from me made her instinctively take a step back and lower her arms. I walked right past her, placed both hands on the heavy mahogany doors, and shoved. The hinges groaned loudly, shattering the tense atmosphere inside. The doors swung wide open. The eyes of every board member and the audit committee snapped toward me. At the head of the table sat Mark. He looked like hell exhausted, pale, his eyes bloodshot from a night of sheer panic. When he saw me walking in like I owned the place, he reacted like a cornered snake. He slammed his fist on the table and screamed for security to drag the intruder out. I completely ignored his desperate meltdown. With slow, measured steps, I walked to the center of the massive oval table. I swept my eyes over the seasoned executives, most of whom were old guard. Men and women who had built this company alongside my father. They looked confused, some squinting, trying to place my face. I dropped the heavy black binder onto the glass table. The loud smack commanded absolute silence. I stood tall, placed both hands on the table, and spoke in a crisp, unwavering voice carrying the true weight of power. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," I announced, looking them dead in the eyes. "Allow me to introduce myself. I am Sarah Sterling, the only daughter of founder Arthur Sterling. I am the legal owner of 51% of the controlling shares of Sterling Technologies, holding majority voting power." I paused, letting the shockwave hit them, before delivering the killing blow. "And lastly, I am the sole legal wife of your CEO, Mark Davis." The boardroom went so quiet it was terrifying. My declaration obliterated the empire Mark had spent 3 years building and officially flipped the chessboard over. The room was paralyzed by shock. Mark looked as if he had been struck by lightning. His jaw locked so tight it looked ready to snap. He opened his mouth to shout, but no sound came out. The veteran board members began to murmur violently. EVP Richard Harrison, the vice chairman and my father's closest confidant, shot up out of his chair. He adjusted his reading glasses, stared at my face, and upon seeing my father's jawline and eyes, his own eyes welled with tears. I didn't waste a single second. I opened the binder and began sliding duplicate packets to every single board member. The sound of shuffling paper filled the room. Standing at the head of the table, my voice cut like a scythe as I walked them through Mark's staggering crimes. I presented the fraudulent wire transfers, proving how tens of millions in reserve capital were illegally funneled into 3 shell media companies. I connected the dots between the LLCs and Chloe Richards' immediate family. The disgusting reality of a CEO draining corporate coffers to fund his mistress was printed right there in black and white, stamped by the banks. The color drained from the faces of the old guard. Richard Harrison's face turned purple with rage. His hands shook as he gripped the papers. He slammed the packet onto the table and roared at Mark, calling him a parasitic, ungrateful bastard stealing the company's lifeblood. Mark was having a full-blown panic attack, sweating profusely. Desperate, he tried to spin it. He claimed it was a legitimate PR strategy to pump the media division's valuation right before the Apex Capital investment. He denied any conflict of interest and yelled that I was a bitter, jealous wife using forged documents to orchestrate a coup. His brazen lies pushed the tension in the room to a breaking point. Everyone looked at me, waiting for my counter. I didn't get angry at his pathetic flailing. A drowning man will grasp at anything. I smiled coldly, pulled my phone from my pocket, and walked over to the AV control podium. I plugged it in and mirrored my screen onto the massive projector wall at the front of the room. The projector light cast a stark, unforgiving glow on Mark's terrified face. I hit play. The 4K security footage lit up the room. There were Mark and Chloe, rolling around on the office sofa. The boardroom speakers blared the pristine audio. Chloe's shrill voice demanding the wife be kicked out. And then, the absolute worst of it. Mark's cold, calculated voice detailing exactly how he was going to use the Apex Capital money to hollow out Sterling Tech, funnel the assets offshore, and force me into a penniless divorce. Hearing his own voice outline a criminal conspiracy was the final, fatal bullet. Any remaining neutral board members erupted in fury, slamming their fists on the table, screaming about fiduciary duty and SEC violations. Richard Harrison stood up, radiating sheer hostility, demanding an immediate suspension of the meeting to draft police reports. Mark completely collapsed. The strength left his legs, and he slumped heavily into his chair, burying his face in his hands. His pride, his reputation, and his stolen wealth were completely eradicated in exactly 15 minutes. The chairman of the audit committee stood up and formally proposed an immediate vote to strip CEO Mark Davis of all duties, titles, and access. Concurrently, all evidence would be handed directly to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. The kill shot had landed. The traitor was finally facing the gallows. Just as the audit chairman finished the proposal, the boardroom doors flew open again. Chloe Richards stormed in, panting like a wild animal. Her hair was a mess, her expensive makeup running down her face in black, teary streaks. She completely ignored the room full of horrified, powerful executives. She ran straight to Mark, who was slumped in his chair. She grabbed the lapels of his bespoke suit, screaming and crying, demanding he fix this. She shrieked that HR and corporate security had stormed her desk, thrown her personal items in a cardboard box, and frog-marched her out of the building like a criminal. She shook Mark violently, demanding he sign an order to fire the HR director immediately. Mark slowly looked up. His eyes were completely bloodshot, like a cornered rat. Instead of soothing his beloved mistress, he gritted his teeth, reeled back, and slapped her across the face with all his strength. The sheer force of a grown man's rage sent her flying backward, crashing onto the carpet. Mark leaped out of his chair, projecting all of his humiliation, terror, and ruined life onto the woman he now blamed for everything. He pointed at her face and screamed the most vile profanities, calling her a stupid, greedy whore who ruined his brilliant career. Like a true coward, he tried to shift the blame in front of the board, screaming that Chloe was a corporate spy, a honey trap who had seduced and manipulated him into signing those contracts. He denied ever loving her, claiming he was just a victim of her extortion. Chloe sat on the floor, clutching her swelling cheek, staring in absolute horror as the man who swore to give her the world viciously tore her to shreds. Then, her eyes drifted up to the massive projector screen. The video was paused on the frame of them kissing and plotting on the sofa. She broke. The sheer humiliation of having her gold digging exposed to the elite of New York broke her mind. Screaming like a banshee, she lunged at Mark, clawing at his face, calling him a spineless, using piece of trash. The two traitors who had once shared a bed and plotted to steal my family's blood and sweat were now rolling on the boardroom floor, tearing at each other like feral dogs fighting over rotting meat. Richard Harrison looked at the pathetic scene with sheer disgust. He hit a button on the table and barked for security. 6 massive, suited security guards stormed in. They expertly pinned the two of them down, twisted their arms behind their backs, and dragged them out of the boardroom. Their vicious cursing and sobbing faded down the hall until the elevator doors snapped shut. The massive boardroom returned to silence, though the air was still thick with shock and adrenaline. The trash had been taken out. Now, it was time for me to rebuild the empire my father had forged from nothing. The disgraceful ousting of the CEO and the massive financial scandal created a terrifying power vacuum at the worst possible time. In exactly 1 week, the delegation from Apex Capital was flying in to finalize the hundreds of millions in funding. It was a do-or-die project for our R&D pipeline. Losing the CEO right before the close usually meant a dead deal and market panic. Several board members were visibly sweating, whispering that this personal scandal was going to blow up a multi-billion-dollar valuation. I calmly restacked the evidence binders, then turned to face the entire board. Standing tall, with the iron-forged entrepreneurial blood of the Sterling family pumping in my veins, I spoke with absolute, unwavering confidence. I proposed an immediate crisis management protocol. I nominated EVP Richard Harrison, the most respected veteran in the industry, as the interim chairman of the board to stabilize market confidence. As for operations, as the majority shareholder, I would immediately step in as interim CEO. I promised the board that I would plug the financial holes Mark left behind and personally lead the Apex Capital negotiations. To prove I wasn't just a figurehead, I asked the AV tech to switch inputs and projected a massive restructuring and revenue optimization roadmap. These were my father's core strategic notes, refined and modernized by Robert Vance and myself overnight. The razor-sharp data, the aggressive strategic vision, and my absolute refusal to compromise silenced even the most cynical old-school board members. Richard Harrison nodded continuously, looking at me with immense pride through his glasses. The audit chairman called for an open vote. 100% of the board raised their hands. Unanimous. The gavel struck the table, making it official. From that second on, Sarah Sterling had officially flipped the script, stepping onto the brutal corporate battlefield to protect and expand her family's legacy. That afternoon, I ordered the admin team to move my things from the third-floor closet up to the CEO's penthouse suite. My first order of business was calling a hazmat cleaning crew. I ordered them to throw out the $40,000 leather sofa and replace all the window treatments. I refused to let a single trace of those two filthy parasites remain in my father's sacred office. Under the iron fist of the new interim CEO, a massive corporate purge began. News of Mark being stripped of power and escorted out by security spread like a wildfire. The executives who had sucked up to him and enabled his fraud were in pure panic. They knew my internal security sweep had ripped out the corruption by the roots. The next morning, the CFO and the VP of Media were standing outside my office, pale and trembling. They brought stacks of hidden ledgers, voluntarily submitting the evidence of Mark's illegal directives in a desperate bid for immunity. I took the documents with an icy stare, immediately suspended them without pay, and locked them out of the network pending a full forensic audit. I hired 2 of the Big Four accounting firms to run 24/7 audits. Within weeks, the financial bleeding was stopped. The FBI froze the shell company accounts in Delaware, and the stolen millions were in the process of being repatriated. The company underwent a brutal but necessary surgery, cutting out the cancer that had been eating it alive. Incompetent managers were fired, replaced by brilliant, hungry, and ethical young talent. The energy in the building skyrocketed. Sterling Tech felt like a well-oiled machine again, ready to dominate the market. The legal battles moved with terrifying speed and absolute brutality. My divorce was finalized rapidly in the Manhattan Supreme Court. Thanks to Robert's aggressive litigation and the undeniable proof of infidelity and financial fraud, Mark was utterly destroyed. He lost all claim to the Atherton estate. The judge hit him with massive penalties for defamation, emotional distress, and ordered him to repay my personal financial losses, leaving him buried in crippling debt. But civil court was just the warm-up. The Southern District of New York picked up the criminal case. Mark was indicted for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy. The once untouchable corporate titan was reduced to a hollow shell. At his sentencing, wearing a beige prison jumpsuit, he slouched at the defense table, too terrified to look anyone in the eye. The federal judge handed him 15 years in a federal penitentiary. His ruthless accomplice, Chloe, couldn't escape the feds either. The paper trail proved she was the architect behind the shell companies and had accepted massive kickbacks from vendors. Her fake tears and claims of being manipulated didn't save her. She was sentenced to 10 years. They abandoned their humanity to steal my family's blood and sweat, and they paid the ultimate price, trading their youth and futures for cold steel bars. Exactly 1 year has passed since the hurricane swept through Sterling Technologies. Under my firm leadership and ruthless strategic vision, we didn't just survive the crisis, we soared higher than ever. My negotiations with Apex Capital were a massive success, exceeding all funding expectations. With that capital, we finalized and launched Nova, a revolutionary, AI-integrated next-generation microchip designed entirely by American engineers. The launch of Nova cemented Sterling Tech as an undisputed titan of the global tech industry. The product launch was held at a packed ballroom in the Javits Center. Hundreds of press cameras flashed like lightning. Walking out to deafening applause from our investors and employees, I took the center stage wearing a razor-sharp, bespoke white suit. With a confident smile, I broke down the technical specs and market applications of the Nova chip. The sheer charisma, poise, and intellect of a true female leader shattered any lingering doubts about my ability to run the empire. During the Q&A, a veteran tech journalist bravely stood up and asked about the brutal personal trials I had endured over the past year. Standing in front of hundreds of people, looking directly into the cameras, I smiled softly, but with eyes like steel. I will never be defined, nor defeated, by a failed marriage or a pathetic betrayal, I stated clearly. Hardship is nothing but a hammer, striking hot iron. It only makes a true leader's will stronger and more unbreakable. Late that night, after the massive celebration party wrapped, I returned to the penthouse office. I stood quietly by the floor-to-ceiling windows, taking a sip of a bold Cabernet, looking down at the glittering skyline of Manhattan. The endless stream of headlights below looked like the unstoppable flow of life itself. After surviving the fire and the betrayals, I finally understood the absolute truth. A woman's ultimate safety and foundation will never be found in a man's cheap promises, nor on a flimsy piece of marriage paper. The greatest armor you can possess is absolute financial independence, a razor-sharp mind, and the ability to stand up from the ashes and build your own glorious empire with your own two hands.